In your school experience, have you ever felt like you couldn't bring different aspects from your culture, such as your language or your food, to school because you feared being different?
I would say yes, I have felt as if I couldn't bring aspects of my home into the school. I think more so in elementary school than high school, but it was also evident in both. Mostly because I just didn't want to be seen as different, especially when bringing food to school for lunch. Just having kids, make comments, look at the food differently, just made me feel very embarrassed and kind of judged in a way. And also being scared to wear traditional clothing to school during our holidays like Diwali or Vaisakhi, even though it's customary to wear traditional clothing, I just, instead of having kids look at me different or say things about me, I just wouldn't wear them because I'd be too scared of what they'd say.
I think the biggest one for me was bringing in a different type of food. And my dad would cook in the morning. You cook like chicken, vegetables with rice, so just your typical Asian food. But a lot of my friends had like sandwiches or like leftover spaghetti, like typical Western food.
Yeah.
Um, so I never really liked to bring in what my dad cooked because they always smelled different, and people were always like, "What is that? Like that looks interesting." Um, so I always wanted my parents to like make me a sandwich or let me bring the Lunchables or something that like was normal to other kids. Um, and I think for languages, my family comes from Malaysia. We're part of the Bidayu tribe, indigenous to Malaysia. So one of the words for grandparents is babe, but um, my cousin had mispronounced that, and when he called my grandpa, he called him Babu, and so that's what we call him now. And so it's not a direct Malaysian word, but it comes from it. But I never liked to call my grandpa out loud in front of other kids when he would pick me up because no one else would call their grandpa that. Like it was a strange word. Like no one would know what it is or what it means. So that was one that like I had no trouble calling my grandma mama because that was like everyone, not everyone, but that was a more normal word to call like your mom or your grandma. So those are the two big things for me.
Yeah, growing up, it's kind of rough for me. A lot of people didn't speak my language at school, so I didn't really get to have that social interaction with people. And language was a big part of growing up, but it wasn't a big part of growing up in a good way for me. It was never like acknowledged properly. So, like for me to speak my language at school, which is Tagalog, made me felt insecure. A lot of the kids at that time did not respect the language, so speaking that language in itself was another part to get made fun of. So it kind of made me ditch my language over time, and now I can't really speak my own language, which sucks.
So I never personally felt this way, probably because my culture is very westernized. However, I did notice that other people in my schools with different cultural or ethnic backgrounds weren't really given an opportunity to express theirs as much as I was, probably because they weren't really recognized or taught about as much in the schools that I was at.
Definitely in high school, I being a Chinese Canadian surrounded by Caucasian peers, there were a lot of kind of jokes flying around about how Chinese people eat dogs and other type of exotic animals and such, and so that kind of hit kind of close to home because it was always kind of prevalent. I also remember showing up to school with homemade dumplings, and the dumplings had fermented cabbage in it, which kind of had like this fermented smell, which was actually quite pungent. So when I would show up to school with that, my friends would poke fun at me about just how my food smelled like you know like garbage or whatever, and then that kind of made me not want to bring that food to school anymore, and it made me kind of just not want to bring parts of my unique culture to public because it was the constant fear of judgment just from being different.
Yeah, for sure. I think food and language are definitely something that I struggled with, but also something different was that the clothing that I wore was also different. And I think that was something that I was kind of ashamed to bring to school. And to just bring some context to that, my parents both immigrated from China when they're in like their late 20s and stuff. And so when they came here, obviously Canada was not home to them. So when I was growing up as a kid, we'd often go back to China a lot. And whenever they came back, either with us or just when they went by themselves, they would bring back souvenirs, and these souvenirs would oftentimes be clothing, and these clothing would be just different from what Westerners, I think, or people at my school would wear. Like, I wouldn't be the typical Gap clothing or the logos that you normally see. They would just be like more Asian. They would have like random girls on it, or just like weird cartoons that most of us here don't grow up knowing. And I think not that people necessarily judged me, but I definitely did get looks, and people often would ask me what characters were on those shirts, and I never would have an answer because for myself as well, I didn't really grow up watching them, and I just wore them because they were clothing. But I think just growing up, I learned to stop wearing them because I didn't want these people to ask me questions, or I didn't want to be looked at a certain way because of what I was wearing. And so whenever my parents did go back or bring me clothes, I would never wear them because I was embarrassed of them, and I would often hide them or just buy other clothes when I went out with them. And another aspect of my life that was related to my culture, and that I was fearful of sharing at school, was just this one time I sprained my ankle, and instead of my mom taking me to like my family doctor for like painkillers, or something of that sort, she took me to the Chinese like doctor, and there it was just like herbal medicine. And so what it was basically, I'm not too sure like the logistics or whatever of it, but it was basically just this like cloth wrapped, and inside was like herbal medicine, and it kind of like wraps your wounds or whatever. It wrapped my foot, my ankle. And so whenever I went to school, people were like, "Oh, what's that smell?" And at first I didn't know that it was coming from me, because at the doctor's office or like at home I was comfortable because we were like used to that smell, but I think it was pretty like pungent. And so people would often ask what that was. And I remember very distinctly that someone was like, "Oh, it's coming from Flora." And then at first I tried to like kind of mask it off, but like it definitely was coming from me. And so I remember that night coming home after like the first day I wore it, I like took it off. And with this kind of medicine, you're supposed to keep it on for a few days for it to have the full effect and stuff. But I just remember like crying, being so embarrassed that this smell was coming from me. And although that my parents had like my best interest at heart, wanting to heal me, I would rather risk not being judged at school. And I think just at such a young age, when these things are supposed to help you, like your clothes and just medicine for that sort, it really was kind of hurtful and detrimental to my mental health, because at such a young age I was already caring about what other kids thought about me and just being ashamed of my culture. And yeah.
Did you ever resist learning more about your culture because of your school experiences?
I think I did resist learning about my own culture because I wanted to fit in with everyone else so badly that I spent most of my time and energy learning about Western culture when I could have used that time to learn about my own.
Growing up and even till now, I've never had another classmate or even a friend who was also indigenous to Malaysia. So I've always really kind of felt like I was the odd one out. Like no one really understood my culture or anything. So I've never really tried to express it or like show it in any way. I've always just blended in and then like kind of learned about my friends' cultures or whatever was going on in school. Because I knew like even if I told people about it, like no one would know the holidays that I celebrate or like the kind of food that my family makes on special days. Even if I told them about it, no one would understand.
I did. I ended up rejecting my culture, actually. I did not want to acknowledge my culture at all because of the name Fob, which the other kids would use to call Filipinos who spoke fluently, who dressed the way we did. And just because of that, I was scared of being name called. I didn't want to be grouped up with them, so I didn't want to feel like an outsider. So I ended up ditching my culture just to be like everybody else.
So I wouldn't say that happened to me, probably because my culture is very westernized. Mm-hmm. So it is something that is often taught in high schools and elementary schools. It's something that's like usually recognized in courses such as social studies or something like that. So I never really had to worry about that. That wasn't a problem for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely, like even in high school, being a Chinese Canadian with uh, white or Caucasian peers, there's a lot of kind of like underlying racism because of jokes flying around, such as like Chinese people eat dogs or other exotic animals. So that was always kind of prevalent around. It's kind of like who I was as a person and my peers. I also remember sometimes for lunch I'd bring homemade dumplings that had fermented cabbage, and fermented cabbage has a kind of like a very pungent smell because it was fermented. And my peers would often poke fun of me because my lunch smelled weird or kind of stunk a little bit. And so that kind of made me not want to bring aspects of my home culture to school because I was kind of scared of being judged, because who wants stinky lunch and everyone to know you as the guy with stinky lunch?
So, since I grew up in a predominantly white area, kind of with more white kids at my school, the culture was very different in itself. And so, whenever on Saturday mornings they would have their soccer practice or volleyball practice or even basketball practice, I'd be stuck in Chinese school. And I think because of the culture that was surrounding me at school, where I was so ashamed of it because I was always made fun of or left out or singled out because of my Chinese background, going to Chinese school was something that I really did not want to go to. And it was something that I fought with my parents a lot and resisted a lot because I was so kind of just embarrassed about the culture. So why do I want to sit there learning more about Chinese, learning more about my culture when it was something I grew to kind of be ashamed of? And so I would sit in class like with the information in one ear coming out the other, and I just was not receptive of it. And I think just the culture that I had at school, where it made me ashamed, hindered my learning at Chinese school. And so in return, I stopped learning more about my culture. I kind of just pushed that away. And up to a certain point, like my parents just stopped fighting. And so I stopped going to Chinese school. And so I think if things were different and I went to a school where Chinese school was more prominent or it was more acceptable to kind of be Chinese, I think definitely I would have taken learning more seriously. I would have learned more, and I just would have had a better time and actually wanted to be there. And I think in learning, it's very important to be engaged with what you're learning and want to be there. And I think just me not wanting to be there definitely took a big toll in my experience, and it really made me want to resist my culture even more.
If you could go back in time with the knowledge you have right now, would you do anything differently?
I think I do a lot differently, if I'm being honest. I definitely go ahead and tell my younger self that I should stop trying to be like everyone else. I should be proud of who I am and where I come from, because it's most definitely nothing to be ashamed of. And I think I'd also try and educate my friends and my classmates about my culture, which is probably something they may not know much about.
I think I would tell myself, like, even in elementary, all the way throughout high school, just to be proud of where your family's from. Don't be afraid to tell people and teach them about the holiday you just celebrated on the weekend or the food that your grandma just made for you. Just like be proud and own your culture, like share with others your experiences and teach them.
If I could go back in time, I'd like to embrace my culture more openly so I could significantly make a change with people and help them be more comfortable being Filipino.
So I probably would have made a more conscious effort to learn more about the different ethnicities and cultures that were present in my schools, because they didn't do a very good job of teaching them to us.
I think if I could tell my high school self something that kind of is around that same subject areas, I would maybe have myself kind of stick up for my culture because that's who I am, and I shouldn't really take anything from anyone else. I think one's culture and one's background is very important to one's uniqueness and their whole family and what it adds to society. So when you kind of conform to what everyone else tells you, it makes you less unique. Definitely now, outside of high school, that I've become kind of more self-aware about just life in general. I've really quite invested more of my interest into my own culture, and looking back at high school, how I kind of shied away from that because I was scared that I was scared of what everyone would say or think. I would tell myself not to worry about it because that's just who you are and that their opinions don't matter.
I think growing up and just reflecting back on it, it's so kind of dumb of me to feel that way about my culture, because me being ashamed of myself, me being ashamed of being Chinese, me being ashamed of speaking Chinese was not only hurtful for me, but it was also hurtful for my parents. And I think back then, I didn't know that and I didn't really think of that because I was so focused on myself. But looking back on it, it was obvious that whenever I was ashamed of my culture, it didn't only hurt me, like I just said, it hurt my parents as well because they were immigrants and they came here and they worked so hard to provide a life for me. And while they were proud of who they were, I was like hiding at home, hiding behind who I was, trying to appear more white to my peers so that I could fit in. But to my parents, that really hurt them because they were so proud of their identity and I was stripping that away from them. So I think if I could go back in time, I would definitely instill more of a confidence in myself and just kind of tell myself that like it's okay to be different and there's nothing wrong with that and you should never be ashamed of like your culture and who you are because that's who you're made to be and like your parents go through so much for your life and I think it's just so stupid for a few people at school for calling me names for me to be ashamed of myself when like there's so much history that happened in China. There's so much history in being Chinese, and there's so much that we can be proud of. And I think that really shipped away from me. So I definitely, if I could go back, I would tell myself all these things and tell myself, yeah, not to be ashamed of myself because I've grown up to love who I am and to just love and appreciate my culture.
Okay. Well, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation with me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.